Hey guys, if you get your social studies books out first thing today and open it up to page 98, we've not been in them for a while, but you're going to need it today. Social studies books, page 98. Well, we finished our unit on the War of 1812 and Lewis and Clark last week, and today we're moving on. We're just going to talk about one thing in particular, one person in particular, for these last 6 days before Christmas break. And so there's a lot to talk about with Andrew Jackson. This lesson is called the Jacksonian era, and it's talking about Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is the first person to become president who was from Tennessee. He wasn't born in Tennessee, but he later moved to Tennessee. And so we're going to read about him today. And lots of things happened when he was the president. He was a national hero from the War of 1812. If you remember the Battle of New Orleans, we'll probably read about that again today and this week for sure. And then, so he was a hero from the War of 1812, kind of like George Washington was a hero from the Revolutionary War. Andrew Jackson was a tough soldier. He wasn't some fancy government person. He was a tough soldier, and he talked tough and did some tough things that we're going to be reading about. You're going to like him probably at first, and then by the end, you're probably going to be like, I don't know about this guy. He was a great president. He made some controversial decisions, which means not everybody liked him. And you'll just have to decide if you agree with him or not. So page 98 in your social studies book, we're going to start reading here today. You'll have a few questions from this book that we're going to be reading from our textbook, about 5 questions just to make sure you listen to the lesson. And then we're going to be moving on and learning lots more about it from between now and next Monday will be the last day you have assignments for me before Christmas break. So we've got 6 days of Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears and a few other things. So here we go. Let's read chapter 10, the Jacksonian era. We're going to be looking at these questions today. What challenges did Andrew Jackson face to become president? How did Jackson grow the power of the president? How were thousands of American Indians forced to move west? And what was the Trail of Tears? So here we go. Ever since his victory in the Battle of New Orleans, many Americans viewed Andrew Jackson as a symbol of the United States. Jackson was young and strong, adventurous and energetic. Americans felt our country was all of those things too. As a result, many historians have called the years surrounding Jackson's presidency the Age of Jackson, or the Jacksonian era. Jackson's rise to power. Many people around the country wanted Andrew Jackson to become president. In 1823, the Tennessee General Assembly elected him to the U.S. Senate. His supporters hoped that being a senator would help other Americans learn more about him. So a lot of people wanted Andrew Jackson to become president. He was the hero. He was a hero of the War of 1812. He was a tough guy. They wanted somebody like him to be president. And then he was elected as a senator from Tennessee. And let's see what else happens. In some ways, Jackson was very different from the other men who had been president. He was not well educated. He was not from an eastern state. But like many political leaders of the day, he was a wealthy landowner who owned slaves. So there's one thing that you may not like, but Andrew Jackson did own slaves. The election of 1824. In 1824, Jackson decided it was time to run for president. He was one of 4 candidates running for president in 1824. Jackson easily won the majority of the people's votes. He had about 39,000 more votes than John Quincy Adams, who finished second. Adams was the son of John Adams, the second president of the United States. None of the candidates had enough of a majority to be declared the winner, according to the rules of the Constitution at that time. As a result, the House of Representatives decided the winner. In the House election, Adams received the most votes, and he became president. The election angered many people. Jackson had the most votes in the regular election. Jackson supporters did not think it was fair that the election in the House counted more than what the people wanted. Jackson's followers, called Jacksonians, felt that Adams had stolen the presidency. During the next 4 years, Jacksonians did all they could to make life difficult for the new president. They also prepared for the next election in 1828. Wow, an election controversy. Can you imagine that? I can't imagine that happening in the United States. Oh, wait a minute. There's all kinds of controversy about Trump and Biden election too, isn't there? So it's nothing new. It's been happening since the 1820s. Everybody wants their person to win. And they always think the other person, if their person didn't win, the other person stole it somehow. So we'll find out. I don't know if Andrew Jackson's ever going to be president here or not. An ugly campaign. The campaign for president in 1828 was one of the ugliest in American history. During the 1828 campaign, both sides spread rumors and told lies about the other candidate. For example, the people who supported President Adams said terrible things about Jackson's marriage. His wife, Rachel, was very upset and embarrassed by all the talk. Jackson's supporters were just as bad. They accused Adams of being a bad husband and being dishonest. Jackson's wife dies. Jackson won the election by a large vote, but Rachel was worn out. About a month after the election, only a few days before Christmas, she died. Jackson was heartbroken. He blamed his wife's death on Adams and his followers. Now he had to go to Washington, D.C. and serve as president alone. Let's take a look at some of the graphic features on this page here. Rachel Jackson was buried in the long white gown she had bought for Jackson's inauguration. It's the Jackson ticket. You see people with the Trump or Biden signs in the yard. This would have been like a little poster for Andrew Jackson. And then the Andrew Jackson ticket. You can see some of the old-timey things they had when they were running for president or other office. Okay, turn to page 100 now. Looks like an interesting picture down here, doesn't it? With dragons and maybe Andrew Jackson fighting them. Jackson's presidency. Jackson had very strong opinions about many issues. For example, Jackson did not trust banks. He really did not like the National Bank. The National Bank was created when Washington was president. It was the nation's main bank. The bank managed the government's money. It also managed the smaller state banks. Jackson did not like this. Even though he was wealthy himself, he felt that the National Bank represented only the wealthiest people in the United States. It did not look out for the interest of everyday people. As president, Jackson decided it was his job to destroy the National Bank. In 1833, Jackson succeeded at shutting it down. So he shut down the bank. You know, the bank, that money, all the money, the country's money was in this bank, and he thought that money shouldn't just belong to rich people in the country and the government. He thought you should spread it out and help the states out. And so he took that money and split it out among the states so they could have more money to help their citizens. Paying the national debt. In addition to his hatred for the bank, Jackson also hated debt. He did not like that the government still carried a large debt from both the Revolution and the War of 1812. He made it a goal to pay off the national debt while he was president. To do this, the government needed to bring in more money than it was spending. The government still owned a lot of land in the Louisiana territory. The government made this money by selling off much of this land. Also, Jackson cut government spending. His strategy worked. In 1835, the national debt was gone. The country actually had a surplus. It had more money than it needed. So that was a great accomplishment of Andrew Jackson. Maybe one of his best accomplishments is that our country, remember we had to borrow money from other countries to pay for the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 because wars are so expensive. So we borrowed all this money from other countries and we owed this money to them, and it's not good owing people money. And so Andrew Jackson said, let's take care of this. How did he get rid of that debt? Well, he sold that land out west that was bought in the Louisiana Purchase. People bought it, and that money then went to the government. And so he also cut back things that the government was spending on. And finally, the government, our country, did not owe any other country's money. What about today? Our country owes a lot of money. I think it's trillions of dollars that we owe to other countries today. That's not good, is it? Maybe somebody will get our debt paid off again. Veto power. Jackson was not afraid to use his power as president to get things done. In fact, he used his veto power more than any other president before him. Presidents use the veto to reject bills they do not agree with. Remember, the legislative branch, the Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate make laws, but the president has to sign them. Everybody works together, checks and balances. And if he doesn't like the law, he can veto it. Well, Jackson vetoed 12 bills while he was president. A bill is a proposed law. Many people felt President Jackson had too much power. People in Congress especially did not like how he used his power. States' rights. At one point, Jackson used his power to keep the Union together. Many people, especially in the South, believed that the states did not have to obey certain national laws. This idea was called states' rights. They argued that sometimes a national law covered something that a state should decide. In that case, the state could nullify or ignore the law. They felt states even had the right to leave the Union if a national law went against the idea of states' rights. This is exactly what South Carolina tried to do when Andrew Jackson was president. South Carolina's leaders did not agree with a new tax law on imports, so they threatened to leave the Union. That means they were going to say, we're not a state anymore. We want to be our own country. Jackson responded by telling the state's leaders that he would send federal troops there to keep them from leaving. South Carolina's leaders backed down. Let's look at some of the pictures on this page and see what it says. There's Andrew Jackson fighting this dragon. This 1832 political cartoon shows President Jackson doing battle with the National Bank. Yeah, so this dragon represents the bank, the big national bank that he shut down and gave the money out to other people. I guess it took a lot of fighting, didn't it, to do that, to beat the national bank. I can't tell what this person is doing. Can you? I'm not real sure. I don't know who that is. This painting shows a South Carolina woman sewing a cockade or a knot of ribbons. These ribbons were worn between the fight between the states and the Jackson. Okay, let me read this sentence again. These ribbons were worn during the fight between the state and Jackson over the right to nullify laws. So she represents this. She's making this little ribbon there. She represents South Carolina, saying, "Hey, we don't have to follow the laws of the United States. We can be our own. We can make our own laws because we have states' rights." In this little text box here, the age of the common man. Many of the men who now could vote saw Jackson as a regular person or a common man. Jackson saw himself as a man of the people. He felt that it was his job as president to represent all Americans. People like that. As a result, the Jacksonian era is also called the age of the common man. Okay, turn over to page 102 and 103. So here is a picture of King Andrew I. Had I been consulted, born to command of veto memory. So what is this picture showing? Well, the president's actions angered many people. Newspaper published cartoons showing Jackson wearing a robe and a crown like he was a king. They gave him the nickname King Andrew. Study the image and answer the questions below. Well, we're just going to look at this real quickly because we need to read on. Basically, you remember that when we started after the Revolutionary War, we started our own country and we wanted to make sure we didn't have a king again. But with Andrew Jackson doing all these things, shutting down the bank, vetoing 12 bills, they thought he was too powerful. So he was acting like a king, they thought. That's why they drew this cartoon of him. And then he did something else, which was quite controversial. You probably won't like this. It's called the Indian Removal Act. The Louisiana Purchase had doubled the size of the United States. Americans wanted to settle this land. They asked the government to move the American Indians out. So think about this. All this land over here, which we bought in the Louisiana Purchase, there were a lot of Indians living on it. Why? Well, remember the proclamation of 1763? When King George said, "You all stay over here east of the Appalachians. All the Indians can live on the other side of the mountains." So this area is where the Indians were living. And so if we're going to move west, we're moving on to Indian territory. Well, you know what happens. We're always fighting against each other, and there'll be Indian attacks on the settlers, and it's always bad fighting. So we got to get the Indians out, people thought, if we're going to move there. By this time, the Indians had already lost much of their lands. Southern American Indians had formed 5 major tribes: the Creeks, Seminoles, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Cherokees. The map below shows where they lived. Each group had signed treaties with the government to protect their land. Ignoring the treaties, many white settlers moved on to Indian land. Some wanted more land to build farms or businesses. In Georgia, Settlers rushed in after gold was discovered there. President Jackson supported this settlement. He and most of Congress wanted American Indians to get out of the way. In 1830, Congress passed and Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. This new law made American Indians give their land to the government. In exchange, the government would give them land west of the Mississippi River. This land would later become part of the state of Oklahoma. So all of these 5 Indian tribes up through here on the western side of the Appalachian Mountains, they wanted them out of the way, so they signed an Indian Removal Act and said, okay, we're taking your land away here, but we're going to give you this land over here. And so they made them travel to what's now Oklahoma. This map here shows the paths they would have followed, the Choctaws down here in the very southernmost part. The Chickasaw territory, Cherokee, you can see, was all around Tennessee and North Carolina, Georgia, Kentucky. They had to go there. And then the Creeks and the Seminoles were down in Florida. Okay. So he kicked them out. Then we have the Trail of Tears. Most American Indians did not want to move. The Cherokee fought hardest to stay, but it was not enough. After President Jackson left office, the next president, Martin Van Buren, ordered troops to march into Georgia. The soldiers forced all remaining tribes to leave. Cherokee people of all ages were forced to march 1,000 miles to the new territory. The journey to Indian Territory began with the Choctaws. The Cherokee were some of the last to be removed. By the end of Indian removal, more than 70,000 American Indians had been forced to move. The journey was long and hard. Although some American Indians traveled by water or in wagons, most were forced to walk the entire distance, 1,000 miles. You ever run 1 mile? You get so tired, they had to walk 1,000 miles. Men, women, and children walked all day long in all kinds of weather. When they stopped for the night, they had very little shelter from wind, rain, and snow. They also had very little to eat. Hunger made many people tired and weak. They got sick very easily. In the end, about 4,000 Cherokee died on the Trail of Tears. For all of the tribes that traveled to the Indian Territory, it was a Trail of Tears. So it's called a Trail of Tears because so many Indians died. Let's go back one page. These trails, these paths that the Indians followed, these trails, so many Indians died going there, they call these trails the Trail of Tears. And it was all because of the Indian Removal Act. So what do you think about old Andrew Jackson? We're going to be talking a lot more about him for 5 more days. You know, I see a lot of things in our lesson today that are still going on in our country. If I'm honest, and I'm not saying my view one way or another, but if I'm honest, Andrew Jackson reminds me a lot of Donald Trump because they're both kind of for the people. They're both kind of very different candidates. All the other candidates before Jackson had been government type rich people, and Jackson was uneducated and not quite as governmenty, I guess. He was more of a soldier than those who came before him. And then, you know, President Trump was not in politics either. He was a businessman. So it's kind of similar. And then Andrew Jackson was kind of tough and just did what he wanted to do, and a lot of people didn't like it. That kind of describes Donald Trump too, doesn't it? So, you know, there's some similarities there I see as I read them. We've got this election controversy with John Adams. We got an election controversy with Trump and Biden. So history repeats itself, they say. So maybe it's true. Well, you're going to have 5 questions from today's lesson you need to answer. And then, like I said, we're going to be learning lots more about Andrew Jackson and his presidency, and as well as the Trail of Tears. Okay? Thanks for listening to your 5 questions. We'll see you tomorrow.